Today we will begin our discussion of Buddhism, which is particularly interesting to us here in America because it has proved so popular recently in Western countries for a variety of reasons. I think that Buddhism is interesting for us to look at also because there's a lot of misinformation out there about it, because it has been transplanted into the West without too much background information. Buddhism is a religion that began with a single founder, a man named Siddhartha Gautama. He was born in 563 BCE, although that date is debated in different Buddhist communities. He was born in what is now northern India to a Brahmin family. He was a prince of a small kingdom. Much of what is known about his life is legendary and cannot be verified historically. But we do know that he left his kingdom and family behind and became a mendicant, a wandering monk practicing meditation and ascetic techniques, and he eventually began teaching his religion and gained many followers. He was a Brahmin, so he was a Hindu, but he disagreed with many aspects of the Hindu religion at the time, including the caste system, sacrificial system, and the pantheon of gods and goddesses. He was in many ways a reformer of Hinduism because Buddhism does retain many of the same notions about the world, but it also changes quite a bit of it. The term Buddha simply means the awakened one, so it is not a name. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he's often sometimes called Shakyamuni, which means sage of the Shakyas. Shakya was the name of the clan that he was from. Buddhism spread very quickly beyond India, and as it spread, it also evolved and was adapted to the local cultures in which it took root. Debates and dissension began very quickly after the death of the Buddha. The first big split was between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism is what is most prominent today in Southeast Asia, so places like Thailand, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, or Burma. Mahayana Buddhism is the dominant form of Buddhism in northeastern Asia, in places like Korea, China, and Japan. For our discussion of Buddhism, we will mainly be speaking of Theravadan Buddhism, because in many ways it can be argued that it is closer to what the Buddha taught. Mahayana Buddhism includes the idea of the Bodhisattva, which is a person who has achieved nirvana but decides not to enter full nirvana in order to help people on earth so that they can achieve nirvana themselves. But we'll be talking about this when we talk about our unit on Chinese religion. For now, we're just going to focus on Theravadan Buddhism. Vajrayana Buddhism is the last sect of Buddhism, and it is mostly dominant in Tibet, so it's also called Tibetan Buddhism. And really it's a blend of Buddhism and local religious beliefs from that area. Today there are between 200 and 500 million Buddhists around the world. Whereas it traditionally began in India and spread throughout Asia, today there are Buddhists all over the world. It has been spreading both through immigration, as people from the Asian subcontinent moved to North America and Europe, but also through conversion. As we know, Buddhism has become very popular recently in Western countries like in Europe and the US. Buddhism itself is largely based on the story of the Buddha's life and his enlightenment. Like I said, not much of this story can be historically verified, but his life story is generally accepted throughout the Buddhist world as an important teaching story. Siddhartha's mother was approached by a deity in the form of an elephant and told that she would give birth to the savior of the world. Then she became pregnant through magical means, not through normal conception. Then, when Siddhartha was born, he had 32 trademark signs of the savior, including wheels on his hands and feet. After his birth, a sage came to his parents and said that Siddhartha would either conquer the world and become a ruler, or renounce the world and save it. His father, who was also a ruler, wanted him to become a conqueror, so he vowed to keep Siddhartha away from all sadness. Siddhartha grew up in the lap of luxury, never being allowed to see any sadness, sickness, old age, or death. Except his mother did die when he was young, so he was basically raised by his aunt. He had everything he could ever want, however, and his whole life was devoted to pleasure. He also became married, and he had a baby son. One day, he secretly left the gates of his palace to go for a drive. On the first day, he saw a sick man. He had never seen a sick man, so he asked his driver what was wrong with him, and his driver told him truthfully, this was a sick man. This greatly upset Siddhartha because he did not know about sickness. On his next drive, he saw an old man. Again, Siddhartha asked his driver what it was, and the driver told him it was a very old person, that everyone gets old, and that one day Siddhartha would be old too. This also upset Siddhartha greatly. On his third drive out, he saw a dead man, a corpse. He asked his driver again what this was, and he said, "That's a dead man. We all die. Everyone dies." This also upset Siddhartha when he learned about death. Then, on his last ride out, he saw an ascetic, a sannyasi, a Hindu holy man meditating, and asked the driver what the man was doing. The driver said that the man had renounced the world to find peace and understanding. These four things that he saw are known as the four sights. When Siddhartha goes out on these drives and sees sickness, death, old age, and holiness, people who have renounced the world in order to find peace. After the four sights, Siddhartha grew incredibly depressed and realized he could no longer be happy in his world, knowing that he would eventually become sick, old, and die. He made the painful decision to leave his family and home to become a wandering ascetic to try to figure out how to be happy in the world while there is still all of this suffering. So he left home and set out to conquer suffering. In terms of the origin of the world, Buddhism is actually silent. It does not claim to know how the world started, just that as far as we can tell, it's always been there, so maybe it will always be here. In fact, Buddhism discourages speculation on the origin of the world because it says that this is just a distraction and doesn't help one become any closer to enlightenment. It has nothing to do with how to become enlightened, so it doesn't really matter. The story of the Buddha continues as he goes into the wilderness to become an ascetic and focus on meditation and spiritual practices. He apparently was a disciple of many yogis, but feels that they do not have anything to teach him. So he left them one by one and went out on his own. He became a strict ascetic, allegedly getting down to eating only 1 grain of rice a day. Then one day, a woman offers him some food, and he realizes that he can't focus on meditating when he's so hungry. So he agrees, and he eats a full meal. This is when he realizes that starving oneself is really no help at all, because it also just becomes a distraction. When you're not eating anything, all you can focus on is how hungry you are, and it actually is an obstacle to any sort of spiritual progression. This relates to the Buddha's idea of the middle way, which we'll talk about later. After eating the meal, he sits down under the Bodhi tree and vows not to get up until he has become enlightened or has figured out the cause of suffering and how to overcome it. The story of the Buddha says that at this point, Mara, a devil figure in Buddhist mythology, came and tempted the Buddha to give up his quest for enlightenment. He tried to stop the Buddha in several ways, but he was too strong and shunned him and continued with his goal of becoming enlightened. Then, suddenly, in meditation, he became what is called fully awake or enlightened, when he has a flash of insight into the true nature of the universe, the cause of suffering, and how to end suffering. He basically realizes the 4 noble truths, which we'll talk about later. But for right now, the first truth of Buddhism is life is suffering. The second one is that suffering is caused by attachment. The third is that in order to end suffering, you must end attachment. And the last truth is that you can end attachment by following the Eightfold Path, which we'll also talk about later under ethics. Instead of becoming fully enlightened and just living in pure nirvana, the Buddha decides that he must teach others about the Dharma, or religious truth, to help others become enlightened too. You might remember the word Dharma from Hinduism. However, in Buddhism, it means something different. It means the body of Buddhist truth or Buddhist doctrine. He finds the other ascetics that he had trained and gathered them at a place called Deer Park, which is where he became enlightened, and gave his first Dharma talk, or his first sermon. This sermon is considered to be the official beginning of Buddhism, as these ascetics are believed to have been all converted to the Buddha's way of thinking on that day. So they became the first group of Buddhists. The Buddha continued to teach for the rest of his life until he was 80 years old. And the story about his death says that one day he was fed some bad meat, which ended up killing him. So he actually died of some sort of food poisoning. Before his death, however, one of his disciples is said to have asked him, "What should we do now? Who should we follow now?" And the Buddha said to only follow the Dharma and not him. The Buddha always urged his followers not to worship him, that he was only a human being, and that they could each find the truth within themselves and didn't need to rely on any spiritual or external powers for help. Buddhism spread very quickly when a king of India named Ashoka converted to Buddhism after a particularly bloody war. It is said that he was so disgusted with the violence of his campaign to conquer and unite all of India that he renounced violence, embraced Buddhism, and encouraged all his political leaders to be kind and fair to their subjects. He also set up some of the first pagodas, or Buddhist pilgrimage sites in India. So King Ashoka is credited with a huge conversion to Buddhism throughout India after the death of the Buddha. When the Buddha died, they apparently divided up his body, and one part was buried in each of the several kingdoms of India at the time so that many people could have access to it. Each of these places became a pagoda, or temple-like mound, to commemorate the Buddha. Dissension quickly arose, however, in Buddhism after the Buddha's death. Theravada Buddhism continued to strictly follow this idea of self-help, that there are no celestial forms or spiritual powers that can supply help for the individual. Each person must work out his or her own salvation without any external help. Theravada Buddhism is still very much focused on this individualistic form of Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism, on the other hand, means the greater vehicle, and it's split away from Theravada Buddhism. The greater vehicle basically refers to the fact that they believe that there are other ways to achieve enlightenment other than simply self-help. And Vajrayana Buddhism, as I mentioned before, is Tibetan Buddhism. But we won't be studying Vajrayana Buddhism during this course, and we'll be studying Mahayana later when we talk about Chinese Buddhism. Buddhism, just like Hinduism, understands our world as samsara, a cycle of suffering. We are trapped in this universe where to live is to suffer, and we are doomed to live countless lives until we can find liberation from it. So Buddhism does accept the idea of reincarnation, as does Hinduism, and also karma. So the basic laws of how the world works are quite similar to Hinduism. Karma accumulates throughout one's lifetime, and it determines your birth in the next world. However, Buddhism doesn't accept the idea of the caste system, or that those at the top of the social hierarchy have any greater chance of achieving nirvana. The goal in Buddhism is to achieve nirvana through meditation, to focus on being awake and seeing the world clearly for what it is. The difference here from Hinduism is that nirvana is not the realization that you are one with Brahman. It's the realization of the true nature of samsara and the Four Noble Truths, which we'll talk more in detail about later. Understanding that life is suffering, and then eradicating desire and therefore suffering is what you focus on to achieve nirvana. Mahayana Buddhism, as I mentioned before, introduces the idea of the bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is a person who achieves enlightenment or vows to achieve enlightenment, but refuses to go into full nirvana out of compassion towards others. They don't feel that they could enter nirvana while all other people are still stuck in samsara. So Mahayana Buddhism believes that there are these bodhisattva figures who are available to help individual Buddhist practitioners. They live in a celestial realm or heaven-like place, and people can pray to them for help in their own quest for enlightenment. Mahayana Buddhism, since they have the idea of all of these celestial bodhisattvas, also has a type of heaven-like place. You can be reborn in these heavens, or sometimes they're called Pure Lands. In Pure Land Buddhism, a sect of Mahayana Buddhism, they focus on the bodhisattva Amida or Amitabha, who is said to have vowed to help people become enlightened. So all you have to do is believe in Amida's grace and chant his name, and you can be reborn in this Pure Land, where you can continue to achieve good karma and become enlightened very quickly. They also envision a universe where there's 7 realms, and you can be reborn in any of them. and that the next Buddha will be someone called Maitreya. So Mahayana Buddhism also opens up the idea of the Buddha, saying that there have been many Buddhas before Siddhartha Gautama, and there will be many Buddhas after him. And the name of the next Buddha will be Maitreya. So they believe that Shakyamuni or Siddhartha Gautama was just the Buddha for this age, but when people get too off track again, a new Buddha will need to come and turn the Dharma wheel or reintroduce the truth of Buddhist teaching. We'll talk about Mahayana Buddhism later when we talk about Chinese religion, because this form of Buddhism is most popular in China, Japan, and Korea. Buddhism is a non-theistic religion. There is no belief in a higher God or power that can help human beings. The Buddha, however, did not necessarily say that the Hindu gods did not exist. He simply said that they can offer humans no help in achieving enlightenment. So as with the origin of the world, Buddhism doesn't definitively say that there is or is not a god or gods, but just that it doesn't really matter because they can't help you achieve enlightenment. Buddhism instead is focused on self-help, that we must work out our own salvation for ourselves and not rely on anyone or anything else for help. Another major doctrine of Buddhism is that of no self. The Buddha denied the existence of the Atman or personal soul of Hinduism. He believed that we have no absolute essence. There is nothing within us that is absolutely or uniquely us and unchanging. We are merely a collection of our experiences, relationships, feelings, situations, etc., which means that we are changing all the time because the external circumstances of our lives change all the time. We are therefore constantly changing who we are because of this change in the world. So if you think of who you were when a baby, you can ask yourself, are you that same person? Is who you are today somehow connected to who you were as a baby? Or are you a completely different person because so much has happened to change you and to change the world around you? The Buddha says that who we are as a baby has no connection to who we are now or who we will be tomorrow, 5 years from now, or 20 years from now. Just to note, the no-self or an-atman doctrine is a very complicated doctrine, and it's something that Buddhists spend their whole lives trying to understand, trying to wrap their minds around this idea of no-self, that there is nothing about us that is uniquely us. We are just a collection of constantly changing thoughts, experiences, and reactions. So it's not a simple doctrine to understand. So even though Buddhism does believe in reincarnation, it interprets it slightly differently. Functionally, it's virtually the same idea. During life, our actions cause good or bad karma to accumulate, and this karma determines our next lifetime. However, in Buddhism, this karma doesn't attach to our soul because there is no soul. All you are is basically your karma, which is changing all the time. And this is what you take with you into the next life. In terms of cosmology, again, Buddhism says that we have to work out our own salvation for ourselves, or our own enlightenment for ourselves. There is no outside help, no spiritual being that's available to help us. We must seek the truth within ourselves through meditation. We contain the truth of samsara and nirvana within ourselves. It's just a matter of getting to a point where we can become aware enough of the reality around us to comprehend this truth. Also, the Four Noble Truths are really the crux or the pivotal doctrine of Buddhism. It's the foundation of all Buddhist thought and is what first caused the enlightenment of the Buddha. So the first truth is life is suffering. However, this is not to be understood strictly as meaning that all life is painful. You can also translate it as all life is unsatisfying, because we are never completely satisfied. Even when we are happy, that circumstance can't last forever, so it is also a source of suffering. The second truth says that suffering is caused by desire. We suffer because we always want more. We always desire something, even if it's just the desire for happiness, health, prosperity, or even existence. Desire causes suffering because desire causes expectations, and life cannot always live up to our expectations. So eventually, all expectations lead to suffering. In order to end our suffering, we must end our desire. If we don't want anything, if we don't expect anything, then we can never be disappointed. So the third noble truth is saying that we must give up desiring anything to become truly happy and to overcome suffering. And in order to end desire, obviously this is not an easy thing to do. You cannot just decide to give up desire and then do it the next day. You have to follow the Eightfold Path, which we'll be looking at more closely. The path is basically a way to become more fully awake and live an ethical path to give up desire and achieve enlightenment. For Buddhism, the central problem of humanity is ignorance. Ignorance in relation to the true nature of the world. Buddhism sees most people as being asleep in the sense that they do not recognize what our lives truly are. Ignorance means that we don't see that our desire is what is keeping us trapped in samsara. We don't understand that there is no self, so we cling to ourselves for no reason. Understanding that there is no self, according to Buddhists, would wake us up. And we need to be awakened to the truth of samsara, the truth of no self, and the fact that all life is suffering. We rely on all these other things that aren't real, such as ourselves, spirits, gods for help, material possessions. We cling to all these things so that we don't have to face the truth of our world and ourselves. In order to help deal with facing reality full on as Buddhism sees it, Buddhism has this idea of taking refuge, because to accept the Buddhist worldview can be quite harsh, and to be awakened to the fact that there is no self and external help for us in the world can be a daunting task, according to Buddhism, to truly become awake to these truths about the world. So Buddhists take refuge in the three gems. They are supposed to be three sources of support and guidance. The first gem is the Buddha, so we can take refuge in the example and teachings of the Buddha. The second gem is the Dharma, which is the summation of Buddhist teaching. So all the Buddhist doctrines and truths could be considered Dharma. Dharma in Buddhism also means does not mean righteous action like in Hinduism, but means more religious truth. It is said that when the Buddha was awakened, that he had, quote, turned the Dharma wheel, or given the world the true Dharma again. So his speeches are called Dharma talks, and even today, Buddhist sermons are called Dharma talks because they give facts about Buddhist doctrines or truths about the world. The last refuge is the Sangha, or the body of Buddhist monks and nuns. This is a refuge for Buddhists because the Sangha is seen as a teaching body, or the local experts on Buddhism, and they are a source of creating good karma. In Buddhist communities, lay people give food and supplies to the Sangha in order to create good karma. So Buddhists can take refuge in any of these three for spiritual support. The main scriptures in Theravada Buddhism are known as the three baskets, or Tripitaka. This name comes from when the disciples of the Buddha first wrote down his words and teachings, they divided them into three baskets, which gave them their name. The first basket is the suttas, or actual discourses by the Buddha. However, Buddha never wrote down any of his own teachings, so these were written down after his death by his first disciples. The second basket is the Abhidharma, which are the philosophical meditations on the words of the Buddha, so basically interpretations of his teachings by some of his closest disciples. The last basket is the Vinaya, which are rules for the monasteries, so things that monks and nuns have to do if they want to become part of the Sangha. There are hundreds of rules for monks and nuns that they must follow in order to live in a monastery. Now let's talk about ritual. On a daily basis, Buddhists are encouraged to engage in meditation. Meditation is basically a practice in emptying the brain of all thoughts and simply being aware of everything inside and outside oneself. To try and keep your mind focused only on that very moment. To be aware of our own bodies, the sounds around us, etc. There are many types of meditations, and some may focus on breathing, some may focus on a word, on a color, an image. There's lots of variety in terms of how people meditate. On a monthly or so basis, Buddhists would likely visit their local temple, not necessarily for a worship service, since there is nothing to worship in Buddhism, but more for educational purposes or to give to the monks or nuns there. In Buddhist communities, local lay people help to take care of the monastery. They'll give food, clothing, help with the chores around the temple in order to gain good karma. Also, the monks and nuns are considered the local experts on Buddhist doctrine, so they'll hold educational meetings, meditation sessions, dharma talks, etc. for the local people. On a yearly basis, Buddhists celebrate the Buddha's birthday. This is a major holiday each year. Furthermore, as the day that the Buddha died is also believed in many cultures to be the same day that he achieved enlightenment and the same day that he died, the same date of the year, so it's celebrating all of that at once. So it's really celebrating the Buddha's entire lifetime. For many cultures, it's a day of festivities, feasting, and remembering the message of Buddhism. It's celebrated throughout Asian Buddhist countries, though in very different ways. Some countries it's more of a festive occasion, and for other countries it can be more of a solemn, sort of reflective occasion. The second major holiday is the robe ceremony. The robe ceremony is a yearly ceremony in which the local lay people in Buddhist communities give gifts to their local monastery. This is when they provide the monks or nuns with everything they'll need for the upcoming year. On a regular basis, they may give them food or help with the chores, but during the robe ceremony, they give monks, first of all, new robes, hence the name, the robe ceremony, but things like toothbrushes, toiletries, warm coats, anything that they might need for the coming year, since monks and nuns are not supposed to handle money or own anything. This is considered a time to gain a lot of good karma, so all villagers try to give whatever they can to the Sangha. Additionally, many Theravada countries encourage young boys or girls to spend a certain amount of time, maybe a few months or a few years, in a monastery before entering adulthood in order to become a better part of that society. For example, in Thailand, the king is expected to spend some time training at a monastery before he can rule the country so that he learns how to rule correctly and with compassion. There are not many of the rituals that are present in other religious traditions in Buddhism. So, for instance, there's no elaborate birth ceremony, there's no Buddhist wedding ceremony, mostly because the Buddha downplayed the importance of rituals. He felt that the Hindu rituals of his day were not beneficial and just alienated part of the society from participating in the religion. There is a Buddhist funeral ceremony, which varies in different countries and includes many ceremonies at certain intervals after the death to ensure a safe passage of the person into their next life. Alright, so this is the end of the first part of Buddhism, and we'll continue with the second half of Buddhism.